Hello and welcome to a very special week here on Pondering Papayas. We take you behind the scenes of the McLaren team. Each day we're going to be bringing you an interview of someone who's either worked for the team or has a very special connection to it, and they'll give you a fascinating insight into what life at the MTC is like. To kick the week off, we are revisiting some of our previous interviews that older listeners may already have heard, but fear not, as there'll be two brand new episodes on Thursday and Friday. On today's episode, we're speaking to Henry Chilcott, who from May 2017 to July 2020 was McLaren's Group Marketing Director. During his tenure, Henry helped to make the working side one of the most marketable teams on the F1 grid, and he took time out of his busy schedule to chat with us all things McLaren and what makes Zak Brown so good at what he does. So joining me now, as promised, is Henry. And Henry, once again, huge thanks for you joining us, especially such a busy time in the Formula E world. You're off to Monaco in a few days. But yeah, so thanks for really giving us the time to join today.
Real pleasure to be here.
So we're going to dive straight in because I know you're a very busy man. Before we get to the McLaren, because obviously you had the role of Group Marketing Director, but before we get there, let's sort of talk about how you got into that position, how you sort of your career started. Let's go back right to the early days. Was a career in sport and sport marketing always something you wanted to do, or was it sort of something you sort of fell into, really?
I mean, as ever with these things, a lot of luck, some hard work, and I find myself here in sport. I'd always wanted to, but that's not where I started. Well, it kind of is, actually. I started in sports marketing with the Champions League and McDonald's years ago, like 1998, I think. That ages me. But I was in the advertising industry for 18 odd years. Never really worked on a sports property in that time, much as I would have loved to. But then later on, in an agency called Antidote, we worked on. We got a very close to the early stage development of what became Team Sky. So with Sir Dave Brailsford. So right there from the beginning, to help create the brand for Team Sky, design everything around it. And what was really interesting about that is Sir Dave Brailsford he's a phenomenal leader, but he's always quite self-deprecating. And he was saying, like, I don't know much about marketing and brand, but my instinct is it could be a marginal gain. So, his whole success through the aggregation of marginal gains. So he really embraced that and saw how if we got that right, we could enhance the performance of his team by creating powerful brand and culture within the organization. So that was just an opportunity that came through that world in my time in advertising. But that was ultimately, you can always join the dots up looking backwards. That's what propelled me into sport. And it was that story and what I did there that got me into McLaren. And then, of course, from McLaren, I joined Formula E.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of dive into Team Sky a little bit. If our listeners don't know, they're obviously a very successful cycling team. Started in 2010, obviously went on to win multiple Tour de France's. Like you mentioned, Sir Dave Brailsford really behind it, and now is trying to do sort of similar with Manchester United, and Sir Jim Ratcliffe, who's also, of course, part owner of Mercedes. What was it like back then? Because obviously you're starting a team from scratch, and especially from your point of view, you're now trying to market an unknown entity. Like, how do you go about that? How do you approach potential sponsors saying, look, this is who we are, like, this is what we want to do, when you've got no history to rely on, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sir Dave Brailsford is a helpful person to have there when you're starting from scratch. So he'd had extraordinary success in Team GB with the British Olympic cycling team, and of course there are a number of track cyclists, the likes of Mark Cavendish, who moved over to road racing, UCI road racing. So having him there with such a clear vision and ambition for what we could do was a big part of it. Interestingly, how my worlds collide. He was massively influenced by McLaren. So you could argue that the originator of marginal gains theory was McLaren and Ron Dennis. And if you've been to that building or spent any time with them, you know that whole detail oriented, looking for 10th. I mean, it's a very motorsport view as well, but looking for opportunities absolutely everywhere. He was massively inspired by that. So he took that and then looked at the pro cycling peloton and just thought, no one's doing this. No one's doing this. And I guess the fact that he got as far as to see brand as a big driver of opportunity of driver performance. He looked at everything: psychology, sleeping patterns, obviously the training programs, nutrition, brand. He wanted, when they put their team kits on, to feel the jersey on, to feel like, yeah, kind of superhuman. And he looked at the rest of the peloton and just thought, he described it as a screaming neon logo park.
Yeah.
And he wanted to create the first brand in pro cycling, and so having him there was a big part of it. But then it was about articulating his philosophy in a way that we could then take to partners. So we created a concept called the line, which was about the fine line between winning and losing, the whole kind of concept of marginal gains theory, and that then became not only a philosophy for the team, but it also became a graphic that is maintained to this day. I'm delighted to see, even with Team Ineos now, the line that you see down the spine of the riders is that original kind of concept. So, so yeah, it's a privilege to be there at the beginning of a creation of such a, what ended up being such an iconic and successful team, but very different to what I then experienced in my next step, which is a team which has incredible storied history.
Yeah, I mean, let's get on to that. Obviously, you joined in May 2017 as Group Marketing Director. Before we get to the actual job, how did the job offer come up, or the opportunity? When did you first hear about it, or sort of what was that process like?
I was called. It was clear blue sky. I was called up about it. I was actually consulting at the time, which is kind of code for trying to find work wherever I can. And because I was taking some time out of the advertising industry, and I got called about it, and I thought, it sounds really exciting, but good luck. Like I'm sure I'm not going to have a shot at it. But then the conversation started. They started in the summer of 2016, and I started working my way through the process. And actually, interestingly, the final stage of the interview, this was at the time when Zak was coming in and Ron Dennis obviously was on the way out. And my last interview was actually meant to be with Ron Dennis. And then, of course, everything stopped. And I think people were more interested in their future careers than bringing new people in. So it then went on kind of a hiatus. And I thought, what a shame, but these things happen. And then it wasn't until the following March that the trail was picked up again. And John Allett, who was the CMO at the time, got back in touch. So yeah, it came out of a clear blue sky. It was an opportunity someone approached before, and the rest is history.
Were you a racing fan beforehand, or were you going in relatively
one
clean
of my
slate?
first questions, and I said I'm not a racing fan, and it was interesting. One of those moments, right? As in, but what I did say is I am a generalist sports fan. I love sport, and get me to spend any time with any sport, and I'll become a massive fan of that sport. So the same had happened with pro cycling. I hadn't followed it at all, and then I became a big fan of that. So at the outset, it was something that was I was familiar with in the background of my childhood, but it wasn't one of my major sports. But I think at the time, I remember my CMO at the time, or the interview at that time said, "Don't worry, we got plenty of people who are massive motorsport fans." I don't think that's in fact, having a little bit of distance could actually be a good thing. So I enjoyed that distance for a short time before becoming a mad McLaren fan.
And one of the questions I love to ask people who've worked at McLaren is sort of, what are your first impressions of the MTC? Because I'm lucky enough to have been there a few times. It's just breathtaking. Like, what was it like to work in there as an employee of McLaren? Like, can you remember your first day walking into that building?
I remember the interview and just thinking, stay calm. Because it's an imposing place. It's an imposing architecture. And I love it because it's not just architecture for architecture's sake. There's thinking behind absolutely everything there. But when I first got there, I was blown away. I mean, you'd heard about it. It's kind of mystique about it. In the Ron Dennis era, to get in there, like, I think it's easier I don't think, I know it's easier to get into now than it was. It was part of the mystique. Even having a meeting with McLaren, it was a very a rarefied atmosphere. So, but that pervades, even though different leadership and things moved on a lot in the post Ron era. The architecture remains, the boulevard remains, all those iconic race cars remain. So you feel like you're entering something which is special and quite daunting, but then has an incredible history, incredible narrative. And so I loved it, and I loved the opportunity to then kind of build on that or play some small part in adding to that legacy.
Definitely. Let's get into that then, because you joined at McLaren, and it's one of the most interesting times, but obviously one of the most difficult times for the team, and probably the biggest transition probably since Bruce McLaren. Like obviously going from Ron Dennis to the Zak Brown era. Like, let's start with your job to begin with, then we can touch on the company as a wide. Really, sort of, what was your role as you understood it? Like, what does a group marketing director do? Like, what was your? Because obviously, during that time, sponsorship on McLaren, we can look back at those kind of cars, and they were very blank to what we were seeing these days.
They
Like,
were.
how big was that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. It was in the infancy of the Zak Brown era. So a big part of my role when I joined was to help support drive the commercial growth of the business. So attract new partners into the business. So that was a significant part of it, because that's how you make the cars go faster, get the revenue in. So that was a big part of it. But what was interesting, as ever happens, when you get your foot in the door and you see where you look around, you see where you can add value. I guess my view very early on is that we needed to, and this is done with real respect for a brand like McLaren, but it felt like the purpose that drove the organization wasn't right anymore. And which was a bold thing to think, let alone then articulate in presentation. But the words that would be over the door, if there were words over the door, for McLaren back then, was "We exist to win." So that was the purpose of McLaren. We exist to win, which in some ways I have massive respect for, because I'm a big believer in simplicity. So there's no ambiguity there, right? But my kind of observation quite early on is that if you exist to win and you haven't won, I mean, I think it was 2012 was the previous victory, and I think 98 was the last constructors. If you exist to win and you don't win, then you almost create a existential crisis for the business, because if you exist to win, you don't exist. So we needed to shift away from a world where it's all defined by crossing that finish line first, to what we then articulate as the fearless pursuit of better. So it was all around a move to a celebration of progress and ultimately successful follow, which actually was something I learned from Brailsford. So his view was, don't focus on the finish line, focus on the process. The results will take care of themselves. So then when I came to McLaren, it was focusing all about the result, and it felt, well, that's quite interesting, and was probably incredibly powerful for an era, but was actually quite challenging, I think, for the organization in a period where, I mean, in 2017, I mean, we finished 9th out of 10, which is very hard for an organization and a brand like McLaren to kind of reconcile. So that shift was really important. And I think a big part of my role, therefore, was to reposition the brand for the Zak Brown era and take it to kind of embody that new vision of what a sports brand in Formula One could be, and move forward from an incredibly successful era, let's call it the Ron Dennis era, but an era which was quite cold, Teutonic, grey, and bring papaya, colour, life, energy back. And also bring the spirit of Bruce McLaren back, because interestingly, he hadn't been spoken about for quite a while in that intervening period. And a lot of again, this is me coming from a kind of marketing and brand point of view, but when you go to a brand like McLaren, it's like you open up this treasure chest and you see this incredible history. There are literally warehouses with Senna's kind of race suits and these incredible cars on the boulevard, MP44s, and you name it. It's unbelievable. So you feel a massive responsibility, but how can we draw on that history, but present it in a way which is going to help light up a more successful future? So that was a big part of the role.
And on a practical terms, how do you do that? Because you mentioned there about the car changing to more papaya colours, but away from maybe the thing people see on the track, sort of what methods can you use to make McLaren seem fresh, seem sort of new and exciting to a different audience?
Well, it has to come from the brand, right? So it's not, none of it is manufactured. All of it comes from the origin story. So, and it has an amazing origin story. It has a founder who died trying to make the car go faster, and a founder who, we didn't create papaya. Bruce McLaren created Papaya in a time when it was black and white on TVs, but he worked out that it would stand out the best. So it was about finding out the stories, looking at the history of the brand, and identifying a narrative that connected the origin story with where we were today. And the interesting insight was that McLaren had always been at its best when it had been at its bravest. So through all the moments in its story kind of history, it had been at its most successful when it had been at its most bold. And that boldness had kind of felt like it had gone a little bit. And so then you go, right, how do we bring back that energy, that boldness, that color to the organization and give it permission to win again, even when it's not necessarily crossing the finish line first, because that was obviously going to be a process, but not something you could throw a switch on. So it was about looking at the history, the story across McLaren, including McLaren Automotive. You know, this is a brand that decided to build a road car to beat, you know, because it was annoyed with Ferrari and wanted to beat them at their own game. I mean, that's an incredibly bold move, right? This was the brand that brought carbon fiber into F1 when everyone thought they were insane. They totally changed the game. So again and again, all the way back to the founder, it had made these really brave and bold leaps, and that's when it had been at its most successful. So it was about rekindling that bravery and that energy and that color in the brand. So that's kind of how we went about it.
And what were those early meetings like with sponsors? Because like you mentioned, the low finish isn't going to be that appealing when they've got the offers of someone like a Ferrari or a Red Bull or Mercedes, whoever. What were you saying to them? They're saying like, look, this is what we're going to do. Like, how are you sort of selling the dream of McLaren?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting one, because what's a big bear trap in motorsport is to point at the past, because motorsport is relentlessly forward, right? So, but there was power in that story. So it was about how we can get people emotionally connected with the journey back to the front of the grid. And interestingly, I remember early meeting with Zak talking around, you know, if we can't sell performance, we need to sell purpose. And right now, you know, looking at the latest result, whatever it was, 17th and 18th with Fernando Alonso and Stoffel Van Dorn at the time, we didn't have performance to sell. We had an amazing history of performance, but in the present, we didn't have a performance story to tell. So we needed to articulate the story that was going to emotionally connect with brands and allow them to tell their story through that platform. So that idea of the fearless pursuit of better, this forward looking organization, which has always been on a path to greatness, and all sports have legacies and moments of ups and downs, but making them believe that we were putting everything in place to set the next new exciting era of McLaren, which was going to be one of color, of boldness, of bravery, of ambition, and all those things. And of course, you know, a number of partners departed, as is going to happen when the results aren't there. But then what was fantastic, and that I can remember very fondly, is when you started doing some renewals. So Hilton, I remember, they believed in McLaren and they stuck with, and now they're still there and they're really enjoying the upside. Some other partners, won't mention them, weren't so long-sighted on that. But when we started bringing in some new partners, it felt exciting, because if they're buying into who we are today, it's all kind of upside. And if we believe where we're going to get to, and it's going to be a journey to get there in terms of performance, then if they buy into us where we are today, then when that performance returns, we're going to be flying together. So it wasn't easy, and there were lots of tricks. It was amazing education for me to work with Zak, to work with the likes of Nick Martin, who's still there, Matt Dennington, Lou McEwen, etc., all of whom are still there and still very good friends of mine. Very good at finding a way to entice and inspire people to part with their money to become part of this story. But it wasn't easy. Like in that first season, obviously not easy, but it did build. Like I think I can remember, and I've said it before. So it went from 10th to 6th to 4th to 3rd. Like there was a story there, and people were celebrating, and were given permission to celebrate those victories, even if they weren't crossing the line first, because the pursuit of better is different to, you know, if you don't win, you fail, which was probably quite a Ron Dennis attitude, which was incredibly successful for its era, but just wasn't helping in the present era.
Hmm. You mentioned him a couple of times already. Zak Brown he's known as he's like sort of a marketing guru, isn't he? Like he's obviously he came from not a dissimilar background to yourself, really. Like, what was he actually like behind closed doors when you get to that negotiating table? Like, what was it that made him so good at attracting big sponsors?
Um, he's interestingly, people have a perception that he's bold, he can be brash, very very confident. He is definitely very confident, but he also has an ability to be self-deprecating. So he would I remember him describing himself to me as a sales schmuck. I'm just a sales schmuck, and which clearly wasn't true. A little bit like Dave Brailsford saying, "What do I know about brand?" But then went on to create this kind of iconic brand. So he was self-deprecating. Was the first thing, which I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear. He also had a really clear vision. He went aggressively after getting the right people to help him deliver that vision, and then he backed those people 100%. He didn't tinker. He was very clear about what he wanted. He was very demanding. But when, for example, you were putting a pitch together, he would back you, and in a meeting, he would back you. So. And I remember we had an incredible. The MTC has incredible. I've been pitching my whole life, right? Mostly in advertising agencies. But when you can go start the meeting and start to inspire with the kind of history and then talk about where we're going to go, and then take people on that walk down the boulevard and you're just through osmosis, all of that incredible kind of history that you observe past the trophy cabinets down to the MTC. Oh, shall we show you the McLaren production center where you can see the supercars being built? It's an incredible sales pitch, and Zak was very good at building that pitch in a way which was, I think, more open and more respectful than people expected from McLaren. I think it had got a bit of a reputation for holding on to its past glory and being a bit stiff and inflexible. Mm-hmm. Whereas Zak was very clear, I want to be the most entrepreneurial, flexible partner to our sponsors. I want to be F1, the championship's favorite team. So he was very clear on that. And when we sat down with partners, it wasn't about here's our rights, list of rights, and here's how much it's going to cost you. It was exactly what I used to do in my time in advertising, which is I want to understand your brand and commercial challenges, and then we're going to work out together how we can harness this platform in all its glory and variation to drive kind of positive impact. So there were, and I'm not sure everyone was doing that. So I think people were going, well, this feels different. This doesn't feel like the old world of kind of motorsport, and I think that worked well and continues to work incredibly well. I mean, I was just on the phone to Matt Dennington, who's one of the co-chief commercial officers at the moment, just the other week, and they're doing very well. Like commercially, it's a tough market for sport at the moment. I know that as well as anyone, but they're doing great, and those early foundations that Zak put in and the people that he brought in persist.
Yeah, I can vouch for that. I get an email from their marketing team every day saying a new sponsor's arrived and stuff like that. But you mentioned how the MTC was a secret weapon. Also, Zak was a bit of a secret weapon. Obviously, a couple of years into your stint there, would you say you get two drivers who are very good secret weapons? I'm talking about Lando Norris and Carlos Sainz, because you get two drivers who are very personal, aren't they? They're very not tech savvy, but they're very switched in particular Lando's case. How crucial is a driver or two drivers to promoting a brand as well?
Massive. So in my first year, Fernando Alonso, like iconic, but a certain type of racer in a team that just wasn't giving him anything near the car he needed. And Stoffel Van Dorn, loved Stoffel, but he was, I mean, in a bad car opposite this great champion. So it was tough for him. When we got to the place where Lando was there and Carlos, it was an alchemy. The two of them coming together was it was perfect. And what was great about it is everyone forgets how young Carlos is, right? Like he was brought in and suddenly he was the senior driver, and he is a gentleman. He's fierce and ferocious as you need to be as a driver, but he's very thoughtful, and he stepped up into that role, that leadership role. It looked effortless, and he put his arm around Lando. And what happened is very rare in motorsport, and I don't know whether even if it happens, whether it can last that long, but they both made each other better. Carlos made Lando better. Lando made Carlos better. They got on incredibly well. They had very different characters, but they clearly made each other better. And then from a marketing point of view, the chemistry that you saw, the friendship that you saw, it was all real. I was fortunate enough to make a whole bunch of different pieces of content with the both of them, season launch films and the like, and they were just great fun. They were very relaxed together, and it was definitely a golden period. I remember when talking to Zak around Danny Ricciardo coming in, and it was a big moment, right? Whether what's going to happen. You've got Carlos going to Ferrari, and Danny coming in, and interestingly, like Danny Ricciardo is an exceptional driver, clearly, but it didn't work. And it's fascinating how, for me, I'm fascinated about how brand thinking can help shape culture, can help shape performance, and I spend a lot of time working with Lando and his team on to better understand him in order to help us create the best environment for him to thrive. And what drove that, and again, it probably comes a little bit back to the Dave Brailsford experience I had kind of early on. But if you looking at the data, looking at McLaren, historically, it hadn't had a good performance with rookie drivers. So other than a young man called Lewis, their performance with rookie drivers, it hadn't been good. It hadn't worked out. People like Magnussen, etc. Even Checo Perez, of course, was there for a short period as well. So it was like, right, we've got this kid who's coming, who clearly has prolific talent. How can we make sure that we are creating the best possible environment for him to be as successful as he can be? So that was a really interesting and incredible experience for me. Incredible privilege for me to spend time with his family, his mum and dad, his grandparents, Mark Bowman and Fraser Schreeder, his management team from ADD. Even spent a day go-karting up at Wilton Mill, something like that, where I pushed these things way faster than anything I've experienced, and I stuck them into the tire wall a couple of times. I think I might have bent one of the chassis at one point. But it was an amazing experience to get to understand him, and then working with Andrea Stella at the time, and to help create a framework to help everyone who works in orbit around Lando bring the best to him and create the best environment for him, and make sure that he stays grounded and has got the space he needs to succeed. So not crowding him too much with the commercial obligations on race, all that kind of stuff. So that was a real privilege and a really interesting area as well, because I think if you get it right, brand, culture, values, all those things can and will drive performance.
And in your opinion, what makes a driver marketable? Because obviously Lando is definitely up there in terms of marketable drivers, and I think you sort of mentioned about Ron Dennis era, but maybe more in the general F1 era, like this current crop are so much more open, aren't they, to the wider world? Obviously, social media's played a huge part of that. In your mind, what makes a marketable driver other than the guy that finishes first most weekends?
I think access is key, and some drivers want to give that access. Some don't, and at the sharp end of the grid, you can see how that kind of plays out. And that's fine, because there's no obligation, right? Well, there is an obligation to sponsors to play nice and show up and engage and tell all the stuff that we know that is expected of drivers. But in terms of fan base, it's up to the drivers how much of themselves they give. But it's also a factor of whether they're the things that they engage in beyond the track, whether they can use those as a bridge to engagement with broader tribes of fans. So where Lando has succeeded massively is his genuine passions, whether it be around fashion, whether it be around esports, have become just new additional bridges to bring new fans in. So I think a lot of it comes down to it's like there are some movie stars that just engage better than others. They might be exception. One of them you could have a list of them which are all exceptionally good movie stars, but some of them just have incredible followings, and it's because they work harder to build these connections, or they create things in their lives that that indulge the passions of an ever broader kind of fan base. So it's fascinating looking at Formula One and the drivers in it, and how some of them I think are just enjoying riding the wave of the general popularity, and some of them are absolute drivers of that popularity. And I think Lando sits in that category.
In terms of, you mentioned the current job. I wanted to pick your brains on a particular marketing incident that happened earlier this year. Like, obviously, it's not related to McLaren, but I'm sure you have an opinion on it. We had a team come out called Visa Cash App RB, and obviously they received a lot of criticism at the time for basically being called that. I'm not so much interested in your view on that, but I just wanted to ask, did you ever get like crazy requests from sponsors or something like that, or sort of renaming the team, or did you get something completely mad?
Yeah, I mean, put it this way: like, if the check was big enough, Zak would have gone, right, you got to go make this work. So there is, but I think what happened in my time was, I don't know whether we just said it was this or deliberately, or whether it was just this is just the way it turned out. But the era of having title partners, there was a period when it was just it became rarer and rarer. And McLaren obviously don't have a title; they have lots of partners, but I think not having a title partner just allows a kind of a purity as a brand, which means you're going to connect with more people. I think it's harder to have a title partner than it is, but obviously, money talks. And if you've got a title partner, it'd be great if it flowed. And the one that you just mentioned, it's the best will in the world. I mean, I'd love to have been in those conversations, because with the best will in the world, no one's ever going to have to refer to it as that. So therefore, what you're left with is the branding on the car, which isn't, really delivering what you want from the title partnership. You want that. You want to have a name that flows, ideally, from the commentary booth, so that it's heard a lot. You do sometimes get those asks, and sometimes you have brands come in which feel like it's a real meeting of minds of in terms of the kind of cultures of the brand and the race team, and sometimes it doesn't feel quite. I mean, always we'll find a way to present the kind of the intersection and how they work brilliantly for each other. But of course, some brands just feel perfect, and it doesn't require much work from people like me, and some it's slightly harder work.
Yeah, and I suppose Monster, obviously being a new partner of McLaren, that seems like a perfect fit for everyone, doesn't it? Let's get back to your career. So obviously you leave McLaren in 2020, you move on to Formula E, first as Chief Brand Officer, now Chief Marketing Officer as well. Like, can you first talk a little bit about why you made the move across from McLaren to Formula E, sort of what was inspiring you?
So it was a strange time. This is 2020, so we've just had the opening of the season. First race in Australia was then cancelled, and I was contacted about this role, and I was immediately interested because I was fascinated by. It felt like it could be the future, but it felt like it had a long way to go. And what kind of attracted me to it was I like entrepreneurial businesses, and I liked how Zak made McLaren feel entrepreneurial. But there's nothing quite like being in what was effectively a startup. It was whatever it was, 6 years in, five full seasons, I think, only. So very early days, and a lot of kind of blue water, blue sky, kind of above it. So I was excited by that, and then obviously got talking to the CEO at the time, and it was just left to kind of mull on it. And then you have, as ever with these things, there's always a degree of should you go for it? Shouldn't you? Could it be an opportunity for me to extend my understanding beyond a team into a championship, which I hadn't done before? And that was probably one of the main things. It felt like a bigger canvas. And boy, was it! The interesting thing for me, which I totally underestimated, was the stakeholder group. So in McLaren, obviously you've got your sponsors, your partners, and yes, the FIA and F1, but it's broadly you're looking after those and you're looking after the brand. Whereas in Formula E, of course, it's teams, it's manufacturers, it's partners, it's host cities, local, regional, national governments, the FIA, title partners. It was a far broader stakeholder group, which was challenging. But also you get to work with these incredible manufacturers. And then a great moment personally for me was when McLaren obviously joined the championship, which was obviously a big passion for me to try and do my bit to try and make happen. But having them come across was a kind of personally felt like a bit of vindication, because there was a lot we were working on to get us to where we wanted to get to, and I think we're still on the journey, but I think we've made big strides over the last 3 years. But it was a to go back to your original question, it was a tough decision. And I'd be lying if I didn't kind of look over my shoulder a little bit after I made it. And put it this way: if you could make a leaving card or a video, as it was, that could make you consider actually not leaving at the 11th hour, then McLaren did a very good job of that with my leaving. Maybe share that with you another day. But great organisation, great people, and they, the people there remain very good friends of mine that I stay in touch with. So so it's just the next chapter for me.
And just briefly, because I know we're sort of running over time. What is it that you've got your Formula E? We talked about your storylines or sort of your narrative of McLaren. Like, what would you say are those for Formula E now? Like, what's the main message you want to get across in your marketing campaigns, but also sort of what the sport's doing?
Yeah. So if I talk about the sport in its totality, the kind of purpose is, we call it accelerating sustainable human progress. So interestingly, coming from F1, where it was certainly in the time I was there, and they've made good leaps forward on sustainability, but it was kind of performance at any cost. And there are some incredible stories I used to tell of the pursuit of that performance and what lengths these teams would go to shave hundreds of a lap time, thousands of a lap time. Whereas Formula E was born to be, the way I articulate it, is show that high performance and sustainability can powerfully coexist without compromise. So we make a lot of decisions which have to live up to very high expectations of sustainability. So, for example, we could be 4 seconds a lap faster in Monaco if we had slick tyres. Now, most people don't know that. Most people don't care about it. But if we were just thinking about performance without any consideration for the environment, then life would be easier as a pure play racing series. So high performance, sustainability, powerfully coexisting. So that's the platform which is valuable to all of our partners, because there isn't a boardroom in the world where they're not talking about that. We need to continue to create great products, great services, whatever it might be, but we need to do so in a way which is good for people and planet. So that's an interesting platform for all sorts of brands to kind of use. From a fan point of view, and this is the point I will always make, it's about entertainment. Like, sport is competing with many things for attention, and fundamentally, the most important thing we can do as a championship is to create the most exciting, dramatic championship out there, the most competitive. So that's what we've put a huge amount of focus into delivering. So over the first, I've been here, it'll be incredibly 4 years in July. First couple of years, obviously tough time through COVID, was to focus on the product, to create a product. We created a new race car in the Gen 3. The sporting format, we did a lot of work with the quali. I think we're very proud of our quali. It's really entertaining. And quali is a hard thing to crack. So we focused a lot on making sure the product, the racing, was entertaining and dramatic and felt different. We don't just want to be another version. We want to feel different. And I think we've delivered that. And so we've got, the narrative, our season narrative at the moment is it's articulated as It's On. And it's all about competition. It's all about us believing we are the most competitive motorsport on the planet. We've had now 6 different winners in our first 6 races, and it's dramatic, it's tight, wheel-to-wheel racing, and it's exciting. I mean, if I'm honest, when I first came, I was a bit like, on the racing, it wasn't quite there. There were moments, but whereas now, genuinely, and I'm probably Formula E's toughest critic, I think it's really entertaining. It's a great way to spend an hour. I also love Formula One. There's lots of great stuff happening there. You've got a leader who's running away with it. We did a little activation to lean into that earlier this year with our CEO. But we're proud of what makes us different. But the ambition really is to create entertainment that motorsport fans love, and there will always be a cohort of people who will never want to engaged with Formula E, but there are a lot of people out there who are very happy to go, you know what, it's okay to love both, or more, right? So yeah, and interestingly, go back to McLaren, there was this concept called the kind of McLaren solar system of racing. So at the center of it was the sun, which is F1. That gives gravitational pull to all the other racing series. When I was there was also IndyCar and there was esports. But now it's IndyCar, esports, just about to enter WEC. You've got Extreme E, Formula E. And that's great because it's a iconic race team that loves to race, and it's finding lots of exciting ways to race differently all around the world. So I love that about McLaren. I think going back to that point of the energy we talked about, like it used to be all about Formula One, almost to the point where the road car business was just there to generate revenue in order to support Formula One, right? Whereas now it is a racing team which is racing across multiple series, and bringing kind of energy and color and entertainment to a whole bunch of different canvases. So I think that's great, and it also works really well commercially because IndyCar obviously fantastic in the US, obviously F1 growing over there as well, and Formula E is just bringing a whole different form of racing and that incredible sustainability narrative. So I think Zak's onto something.
And usually is, isn't he? That seems like a great way to end it. Yeah, my thanks again go to you for joining me. That's been a hugely fascinating chat. I could chew your ear off all day about that. So yeah, thanks again once again for joining us.
You're very welcome. Been a pleasure.
My thanks to Henry once again for joining me early this year. My thanks to you as well for listening along. We're on day 3 now of the Behind the Papaya week, so make sure you've checked out the previous 2 episodes. But in the meantime, we'll be back with another episode tomorrow. Thanks for listening.